US election, which is a webinar for educators. We're really excited to have you and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that we here online are on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, as well as the traditional owners of the lands you may be joining us from. So really happy to go ahead and dive right in. We're going to start off talking about the Electoral College. Most of the questions that we got beforehand were around the Electoral College. And joining me in that conversation is Professor Brendon O'Connor, who is a professor of U.S. politics and U.S. foreign relations and jointly appointed between the United States Studies Center and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in the disciplines of government and national relations at the University of Sydney. Brendon, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it right to you to answer the question, what is the Electoral College and why is it important?
Yeah, great that you've all joined us, and thanks for that introduction. I used to really enjoy teaching the Electoral College, and I used to really enjoy sort of studying and teaching American politics. Now it's more challenging, and there's maybe more at stake. But the Electoral College is a system that is so confusing that many of the people explaining it on CNN or the station that you might watch the election on tend to get elements of it wrong because it has a lot of obscure elements to it. It has some kind of very kind of technical details. So I'll try to simplify it. I think it's one of those things that's worth using a few maps to explain it. Without maps or graphics, it starts to get kind of lost. So I've got a very brief PowerPoint. I won't belabor the point, and if I'm talking for too long, Kat will come in and maybe get me to explain things, but I don't want to speak for too long. So I'll just share with you my PowerPoint. Hopefully that's working. Is that working? Everyone can see that?
I can see it, so hopefully everyone else can as well. I'll also
Okay.
mention that if you have any questions as Brendon is talking, please feel free to pop those in the Q&A and we can answer some of them.
So the key thing to realize about the American election system is that the person who wins the most votes across America doesn't necessarily win the election. Al Gore won more votes in 2000 across the US and lost the election on a very disputed kind of case over Florida. Similarly, Hillary Clinton, 2016, got more votes across America than Donald Trump, but didn't win the election because of the system is based on this thing called the Electoral College. And the Electoral College, in a kind of short form, is each state is worth a certain amount of Electoral College votes, depending roughly on its population. So California is currently worth 54, where you'll see small states like North Dakota or Maine is only worth 3 Electoral College votes. So this is a sense of, well, in the case of Maine, 4 Electoral College votes. So this is a case that the small states, obviously, population-wise, get to have less say. Now, the states that are in a kind of beige or brown in my map, these are really where the election will be fought out in these swing states because it's a state-by-state election system. So it comes down to the states which tend to be the closest, which might swing from one election to the next. You need 270 Electoral College votes to win the election. My next slide points out that this isn't really a system where every vote is in some ways worth the same amount. In some regards, a vote in Wyoming, the smallest state in the United States in terms of population, is probably worth about 3 votes in Electoral College terms compared to Florida or Pennsylvania or Michigan or Virginia. So there's a bias in some regards to the smaller states because no state can have less than 3 Electoral College votes. That's their 2 senators and their 1 representative. Where does the system come from? It comes from the Constitution of the United States at the end of the 18th century. The Electoral College was a way of, in some ways, recognizing America as a federation of states rather than seeing the country as just one nation in terms of electoral votes. As I said before, Electoral College votes roughly based on proportionate to population, but the complicating factor in the Electoral College is that each Electoral College vote translates in some regards to a person, and we call that person an elector, which I'll come back to in a minute. When the system was devised, there was a lot of disputes between the North and the South in terms of the kind of distribution of electoral college votes and representatives. And one of the elements of this was whether to count slaves in the South, where most slaves were at this time, on the basis of kind of the total population of a state. The compromise that was worked out was to count slaves as 3/3 of a person, or count 3 out of every 5 slaves. This, of course, reminds us of how racist the system was from its beginnings, and of the nature of the franchise when America was set up. It's all set out in the second article, first section of the American Constitution. Today, as I said, you need 270 electoral college votes to win. If there's not 270 electoral college votes by Trump or Harris in the election that's coming, then it's decided by the Senate. Now, if there was a third-party candidate like Robert Kennedy Jr. and they won some by chance, some large state or a state, even if it was very close, how it is decided by the House of Reps is pretty complicated. It's not on a basis of votes across the House. Each state votes as one vote, and the majority of members from a particular state would therefore, California would be one vote, Wyoming would be one vote. Republicans are likely to dominate in any situation like that because they tend to dominate across a larger number of states. They tend to be more successful in the rural, smaller states. So if Trump and Harris both got 269 electoral college votes, it's likely the House of Representatives would probably vote for Donald Trump. But there are other complexities in it. Electors don't always faithfully represent the statewide vote, and that you could lead to having 3 candidates up for election. Anyway, that's where it gets very technical. The key dates for the election, and those dates might be strongly remembered more than in the past, are that the winning party gathers its electors, who are basically party loyalists in many regards, of the winning side on December 16. They send their slate of votes to the vice president by December 28. The vice president might be getting her winning votes or might be getting the votes of her opponent this year round. And then the Congress certifies this on January 6th. Now, these are dates that for most of my career, I did not have fixed in my head. I didn't really think of very much, and they were largely procedurally done. The idea that the vice president certifies their own victory now seems a little strange, but generally it hasn't for US history, because this is incredibly procedural and sort of ceremonial rather than politically controversial. But if an opponent doesn't recognize the state total, say Trump lost Georgia by just over 12,000 votes, and attempted to send his own slate of electors to the Congress, then things get particularly messy on how to sort this out. Some of this has been approached by legislation over the last 4 years, but I don't think quite enough of it has been. The last point I want to make is, well, how would you change it? The big way of changing anything to do with elections and rules about the power of various branches of government is a constitutional amendment. This is incredibly hard to achieve. There are 2 methods there. The first method is the only method ever used for the 27 times that amendments have been made. The more easier way to do this is that each state can decide how to allocate its electoral college votes. And if you're really up on this, you might know that Nebraska and Maine have a slightly different system where they allocate 2 votes on the basis of who wins the statewide vote, and then on the basis of their districts. It's likely that Harris will win one of the Nebraska districts, and that might be her 270th electoral college vote. The easier way to change things, as I said, rather than constitution, would be for states to decide that they would give all of their electoral college votes to the winner of the national vote. This has been proposed, and some momentum has been made on this over the last couple of decades. Alternatively, states could decide to allocate their votes proportionately. If Harris, say, got 45% in a state and Trump got 55%, then they would get that proportion of electors. This, I think, has quite a lot of appeal if it was filtered down to the House of Reps, because it would undermine some of the aspects of gerrymandering if there was a proportional sort of allocation of reps to the Congress. And there's a clear relationship between House of Representative members and the Electoral College. That figure I mentioned before, 270, is just over half of 538, which is the total number of representatives in the Congress if you count the 100 senators as well. So there's a lot of detail in the system. It's quite a complicated system. Not surprising, people often get confused and annoyed about it, hard to change. But the key thing is to know states are worth certain electoral college votes, and the winner needs to get 270 electoral college votes. Both Trump and Harris at the moment have clear sort of cases for 220 electoral college votes each. So it's getting that last 50 that really the election will hang on next week. Thanks for your time. And at the end, I'm really happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Brendon, for explaining that. I think that was a great overview. I think a lot of questions that people have about the Electoral College is why this system? Why did, at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, did the founding fathers of the United States decide to use this kind of system? What influenced them?
Yeah, I'm happy for other people to jump in on that as well. We've got people who are very interested both here in American politics, but also American history as well. It was a compromise. There were different ideas put forward that the state legislatures would vote for the president, that there would be a kind of more popular vote option. So it was in some ways, some might see it as a Faustian bargain, particularly the element of the two-fifths counting of slaves. That really starts to remind us of how this was a system of all sorts of compromises, with people in the North, in some ways, maybe counterintuitively saying, well, slaves are property, so they shouldn't be counted. And then people in the South saying, no, slaves are people, but maybe we're not going to count them as much as other people. And so you can see a kind of any digging into the American Constitution or history in this regard gets us into how unequal the franchise was from the beginning, and how, you know, there were lots of elements of the system which I think people would not want today, and in some ways are a stain on kind of modern American politics.
Thank you so
David,
much.
you want to come in here?
Yeah, I see that. David, let me just give a quick introduction, since David's got his hand up so everyone knows who he is. So we've also got Associate Professor David Smith, who's also jointly appointed between the U.S. Study Center and the School of Social and Political Sciences at USID. And he'll be talking to us a little bit later about public policy and opinion, but happy to have him jump in now and help to answer that question.
Yeah, we have to remember that Americans' ideas about democracy at the end of the 18th century were quite different from what they are now. And the idea of direct election for them was reserved for the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives was really the House of the people. The Senate was not directly elected. That was senators at the national level were chosen by state legislatures. And the original idea was that the president wouldn't be directly elected either, that the Electoral College was this actual college of elites. Now, that idea started to break down in 1804. And after the Civil War, there were laws passed saying in every state, Maine and Nebraska would change this, but in every state, it was the popular vote of the state that determined who got that state's electors. So American government can be seen as these sort of sedimentary geological layers of institutions that have built up over time. And what we've actually got with the Electoral College is this kind of relic, this footprint of a time when the president wasn't even directly elected. Instead, now what we've got is this kind of indirect election of the president, where it is the popular vote that determines it at the state level. But first, it has to go through this mechanism of the Electoral College that is a footprint from another era when you didn't have direct election. So there's quite a bit of kind of historical contingency or even historical accident going on here. I think that in many ways, people look at this and say it doesn't make sense because you've got a single national office here. There's no reason why you need this kind of geographic representation that the Electoral College has. But I think it would be very difficult to convince people to get rid of it, especially people who believe that they might have an advantage out of the Electoral College. There's a widespread misperception that Republicans always get an advantage out of the Electoral College. That's actually not true. In 2004, George W. Bush won the popular vote by 3 million votes. John Kerry came within about 60,000 votes of winning that election in Ohio in the Electoral College. In 2012, Barack Obama actually had a significant Electoral College advantage relative to his popular vote. That disparity between the Electoral College and the popular vote often depends on who is running up the score in the big states. So back in 2004, that was George W. Bush in Texas. This time around, we may well see Kamala Harris record phenomenal margins in California, which will boost her in the popular vote, but may not be enough to win the Electoral College. So it does actually vary from election to election who the Electoral College benefits. I think there's some unfortunate mythology out there that it always benefits Republicans, which is not true. But I think that's one of the reasons why it might be difficult to persuade Republicans in particular that the Electoral College should be reformed. Although I think if Texas ever starts going Democratic on a regular basis, I think Republicans would be a lot more enthusiastic about actually getting rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah, I mean, totally agree. That sense of, Texas as a kind of swing state would open this up to, I think, a much broader conversation. And then, some other method, a nationwide vote being obviously the simplest, or some proportional allocation of Electoral College votes, has some appeal as well.
I think it's also important to note that might not be of general awareness among the Australian population is just how impactful state politics are on electoral college politics. And in general, Republicans have been more successful at gaining state houses and therefore control over electoral maps in probably, I would say, the last 20 years or so. In terms of, we have the saying in the US, and I'm sure you probably heard it here as well, that all politics are local politics. And Republicans have really taken that to heart in the US. So you see that there's a lot more state politics that go into the Electoral College than you may be aware if you're looking at it as an outsider. Also, one other point just to bring up that's sort of one of those history things is I know that I sometimes get questions from students about why this system, aside from the compromises, but to keep in mind that the system was put into place at a time when there was no mass communication, right? We couldn't, besides the founders not being a fan of direct democracy, there was no way to really quickly communicate votes. So that's the reason you have to have a system in order to get those votes to the end game. So get them to Congress, get them to certification. I also just want to remind everyone that we are taking questions, so please feel free to pop in questions you might have about the Electoral College. And I'm just going to pull off a question. Oh, go ahead, Brendon.
Yeah, one extra thing that I think is really worth stating is that the kind of chief arbiters of this system in many regards are secretaries of state. And so we're used to that term in terms of, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, John Kerry was Secretary of State, but that's at the national level. The state secretaries of state in a very contested environment like the 2020 election become really important. So Brad Raffensperger in Georgia became a well-known name that I think even the most sort of extraordinary political junkies, maybe David knew about him before the election, but I don't think many other people did. And so this person who was a Republican was at the center of this controversy of certifying the vote in Georgia and then being on a phone call famously with Donald Trump, where Donald Trump, under recording, asked him to find 12,000 votes to overturn the result. And so this person who was a political appointee, and I think for Australians, this is very hard to sort of understand, someone who's been voted in as a Republican, so not a member of the Federal Election Commission or equivalent of our sort of Australian Electoral Commission, this partisan politician has to be the one who sort of arbitrates what is the result and how to certify the result and to push back against claims about electoral fraud. And so that person is incredibly important. There was, I think it was Kathleen Harris, who was in Florida in 2000 in a similar position. Now, some of this stuff can be sent up, as it was in Florida, to the State Supreme Court. And eventually, of course, the Bush v. Gore decision goes to the National Supreme Court. But these kinds of ways of arbitrating disputes, which are not dealt with by a bureaucracy as it is in Australia, but by either partisan officials or courts, is difficult, I think, for outsiders out of America to get their head around and to think, how is this kind of going to be fair? Are these people going to make these decisions on the basis of being very neutral? Raffensperger, I think, had a good record in that regard, but there has been a want to get more partisan sort of actors into the system who are not going to act, I think, fairly and neutrally, but are going to act in a really biased way towards a particular party. So that's, I think, for Australians, I think, and people I talk to, that's a very hard thing to understand about how the Electoral College plays out in a disputed election.
That's some very good points, Brendon. I pulled up in a class I was teaching last week a copy of a sample ballot, and I remember the surprise when I pulled that up that we elect state Supreme Court justices, and that was just, the students who were like, "What do you mean you elect justices? That makes no sense to me." So we've had a few questions about how to, in this process, do we ensure that the election is secure, and also maybe talk a little bit about, is there fraud in elections?
I can talk a little bit about this. Every election, there are irregularities of some kind, and usually those are to do with mistakes. I know people who work on elections in the US, they say every election, some box of ballots will show up in somebody's car a few days after the election. There'll be problems with the ways that ballots are scanned into the machines. There are all kinds of irregularities like that can happen. Those, though, are almost always picked up and rectified because elections are so closely scrutinized. And elections have become more scrutinized in recent years. The last election is widely believed to have been the most scrutinized election in American history. Actual election fraud is very, very rare in terms of instances of someone going out and voting multiple times. Now, every election, someone tries it. But one of the reasons why it's so rare is because it would be such a futile thing. When you consider that the narrowest margin of victory of the last election was 10,000 votes, you'd have to be pretty determined to think that just by engaging in electoral fraud yourself, that you can change that result. Penalties for electoral fraud are also very severe, and they are almost always discovered. There are other kinds of irregularities which often get talked about a lot, but which have no actual legal bearing on the outcome of a result. So this is if someone's address is incorrectly registered or something like that, they're registered in one precinct when they're not supposed to be there. Even instances of someone actually voting and dying before election day happen. These often get talked about a lot. But once again, these are generally very, very rare. And the second thing is that they have no legal bearing on the status of the votes that are cast. One thing to really watch out for on election day is people taking very isolated irregularities and trying to blow them up into something that might actually affect the outcome of the election. It is really worth emphasizing there is hardly any kind of irregularity that ever happens on a scale that could actually affect the outcome of the election. This was one of the reasons why there was something like 69 legal challenges in court in the 2020 election. Only one of them was held up, and that didn't even have any bearing on the outcome in Pennsylvania, which was to do with certain voting sites being open for too long. Yeah, there's going to be a lot more of that this time around, I imagine, especially if Trump loses. it's very unlikely that any of it's going to be related to issues that have a serious bearing on the election. Electoral fraud is a very rare thing. There's a lot of mythology about it. There's a sort of favorite myth that John F. Kennedy only got elected in 1960 because all of these dead people in Chicago voted to win the state of Illinois for the Democrats. It's a funny myth, but it doesn't actually have any basis in reality.
One of the things that's really disturbing about this kind of mythology, about the lies about this, is the harassment of people who work on election days, who count the ballots. A lot of these people, it's very kind of low level, often kind of clerical work that they're doing, but then they've become noted individuals. Some of them have had their names published. Some of them have been harassed by supporters of Trump after the last election. One of them has had a major payout in Georgia because of this really serious kind of death threats and serious harassment that came out of congressional hearings on the last election. So that is something that I think we do not want to see in any democracy, that these people are doing a really important job, and the politicization of that work, the harassment of people who are there to just count votes and do what is a really important job on the day, that I think has been a really, really unfortunate aspect of recent elections. Some of this has come to Australia in recent times, and this is, something rightly to kind of condemn and have little patience at all for people who want to politicize every element of election voting in a way that's not deliberately spreading misinformation. I mean, it's a disinformation campaign, some of this, rather than having anything to do with the functioning of democracy in an effective way.
Thanks so much, Brendon. I think we just have just a few minutes left for this. And so I think the best question, because there's been a few questions about this and the registrations, is we know that we probably won't know the results of the election on election night. Can you explain why that is, and perhaps assure our audience here that that doesn't mean this isn't a secure election or that there's an issue with the results?
Yeah, I don't think we want to assume that we won't know the results, but there's no
That's
guarantee
true.
we will.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's a couple of states that's sort of swing that we're thinking, will likely to be Trump states or likely to be Harris states, I think there is, a reasonable chance that the election will be quite clear by, say, 9 o'clock Australian time on the 6th of November. I think that there'll be claims and counterclaims probably made, but the counting of the results into the next day is only really likely if we are in the margins of these, in the margins of thousands, maybe just 10 to 20,000 votes. That is, as David was saying before, relatively rare. The victories are usually in the tens of thousands, not in the hundreds of thousands. So that become pretty apparent on the day when Trump won in 2016. It was pretty obvious by about midday, around 1 p.m. I was pretty certain that Trump had won, and the New York Times was giving the election very strongly to Trump by the middle of the day in 2016. So it's got to be an incredibly sort of tight margin in a couple of states. One of the things to watch out for, and this is sort of something that betting markets don't always get right on the day, is that early votes tend to come in from rural areas. So smaller sort of population centers, smaller cities get their votes in earlier. It leads to one candidate in the last election, say in Pennsylvania, Trump doing very well across Pennsylvania until the votes come in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, the two big cities of Pennsylvania. And then Biden caught up dramatically and overtook Trump quite significantly. So this isn't always explained as well as it should be. And for a candidate to sort of say, look, I'm so far ahead at this point in Pennsylvania, I can't lose, that's a tactic. And I think we've got to, factor in the city. So it's a good geography test. Everyone starts to know what, the big centers are. Atlanta and Georgia, the big cities in Arizona or Phoenix and whatnot. So this is to be followed. So don't look at the results online at home and think, oh, it's all over because one candidate is 20 or 30,000 votes ahead at midday on the 6th. It's likely the city votes will be tallied a bit later. And if it's super close, yeah, sure, it could be, there could be recounts, there could be, it just could go on for days. But hopefully, you can go to bed on the 6th knowing who the president of the United States is very likely to be.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendon, and thanks so much, David, for jumping in on that. Let us now turn to the impact of the U.S. election here in Australia and across the Indo-Pacific. And for that, I'm going to bring in our CEO of the United States Study Center, Dr. Michael Green, and he's really an expert in this area, and he's going to just give us an overview about what these impacts are. So, Mike, let me hand it over to you and ask you to speak on that.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, David and Brendon. And thank you, everybody, for joining, and especially thanks to the history teachers out there. I am eternally indebted to my year 10 history teacher, Mr. Brendon, at Bethesda Chevy Chase High School in Maryland, and my kids, teenage kids here at Scotts College and St. Cat's, love history and are studying for their exams right now, in fact. That's why it's so quiet in my house. So let me first begin with sort of America, because some people, kind of forget that for all the strengths and weaknesses, frustrations, foils, the direction of the United States is massively consequential for the whole world, and particularly for Australia. The U.S. now accounts for over a third of capital flows in the world, of money that moves around the world, over a third. Last year, the U.S. was by far the largest investor in Australia, accounted for 25% of foreign direct investment into Australia, 25%. Next was Britain, Japan. China was less than 2%. Trade with China is important, but investment that creates jobs, research in universities is overwhelmingly from the U.S. And by a wide margin, the U.S. and Britain are the largest destinations for Australian investment. Superannuation funds. The fourth largest pension funds in the world are Australian, and the number one destination for the investment of your pension funds is the US, followed by the UK. It's also important to remember that the alliance that the United States and Australia have is historic and deep and becoming more important because it's a more dangerous world. The US spends 3.5% of gross domestic product on defense, 3.5%. Australia spends a little more than 2%. Most US allies spend 2% or less. And so there's a burden on the US, but also the alliance with the US that Australia has is one of 51 treaty alliances the US has. So US alliances with Japan, with Korea and the Philippines, with Gulf states, with NATO. These all protect key parts of the world, keep sea lanes open, deter conflict. Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine was an attack on a non-treaty ally, but very few people think he has the suicidal instincts to actually attack a NATO ally. So this treaty that Australia has with the United States, and by the way, in our surveys and multiple surveys, Americans support the treaty with Australia at record high numbers. But it's part of a network of treaties that keep sea lanes open, that keep space safe, cyberspace as much as possible. And Australia is, together with the United Kingdom, the most intimate of US allies. In the middle of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing, Australia has access to intelligence, space, the most exquisite cyber information. So there's a lot at stake for Australia in the alliance with the US. The good news is the American public, the US Congress, by very large margins, loves Australia and supports the alliance, but also strongly supports the alliances with Japan, with Korea, and others. So it's pretty consequential. Now, most of the coverage of this election has focused on Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. That they're compelling, they're interesting. They're not the most popular candidates in American politics, but historically they are incredibly unique figures, if you will. I mean, Donald Trump, all historians, even his supporters would acknowledge, is probably the most disruptive, transactional, populist, shocking president or presidential candidate the U.S. has had in generations. Some might say ever. While Kamala Harris is a week away from possibly being the first woman of color to become president of the United States. So these are compelling sort of historical figures with all that they bring. And it's not surprising that so much of the press coverage focuses on them. But for those of you who teach social studies or studied it in school, you remember that you're supposed to look at agency, at what people do, but you also have to look at structure to understand what's going to happen. And I think a lot of the coverage in Australia and in the US loses track of structure. And so while Kamala Harris and Donald Trump say quite different things, and in some respects will have very different policies, there's going to be a lot more continuity than change, to be honest. And that's because of structure. So one structure that constrains the next president, no matter who it is the US Constitution, the division of powers, the checks and balances. Unlike the Westminster system in Australia, the House of Representatives and the Senate have enormous control over what the president can do. The House, under the Constitution, has authority over the budget and trade deals. And so, for example, Joe Biden put forward a budget recently, and the House of Representatives said, no, thank you, this is the budget we want you to use. The Senate, among other powers, has to confirm hundreds of political appointees. When a new president comes in, not only the cabinet, but the deputy secretaries, the undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries, ambassadors, hundreds and hundreds of positions have to be confirmed by the Senate. So that gives a lot of power to other institutions in the checks and balances of the US system. And what's interesting is when Trump was president last time, those checks and balances were used by Republicans, not just Democrats. So when Donald Trump said he might pull troops out of Korea, Republicans introduced legislation saying he can't get the budget, can't get anybody confirmed. So the checks and balances will constrain Donald Trump a lot. They'll constrain Kamala Harris. Both of these candidates are making big promises. They'll have difficulty delivering on a lot of it, which, by the way, is how the American founders wanted the Constitution to work. They were afraid of an Oliver Cromwell. They didn't want an executive who could just take off and do whatever he or she wanted. Other structure, the public opinion for this region and for Australia is, as I said, very supportive of alliances. There's very broad bipartisan consensus in the public and the Congress that we have to work with allies to compete with China. But there's also pretty broad consensus that the US does not want to decouple from China. So Donald Trump talks about 60% tariffs on China, 20% tariffs on allies. He gets excited sometimes, and if the audience is clapping, he says he'll do 1,000% tariffs. It's sort of like a Las Vegas act. He does love tariffs, though. He doesn't understand economics, but he does love tariffs. He thinks allies rip us off. We pay 3.5% of our GDP on defense, and Australia pays about 2%, and Korea and Japan pay about that, and a lot of other countries like Canada pay much less. You know, Donald Trump's view of the world is, I'm going to force them to pay more, or I'll put tariffs on them. It's a simple transactional view, not without some basis, in fact. But the reality is the US trades more with China than Japan, Korea, and Australia trade with China combined. So there's huge interests at stake here. Soybean farmers, for example, ranchers. And so there's a lot of domestic interest groups, and the broad American public doesn't want tariffs. They make prices go up and they hurt key constituencies. So I guess I'd sort of urge people to think about some of the structural constraints from public opinion, from the reality of the consequences of some of these decisions, from the checks and balances. There are some areas, though, for sure, where they will be different. For example, I think climate policy will be radically different with Donald Trump than Kamala Harris. But even there, the power of states in the US is quite considerable. The pace setter for the energy transition, for climate policies, is not the US federal government, never has been, even under Democrats. It's the state of California. And so a lot of the action in climate would still continue at the states, but that would be different. I think immigration would be different. It's a big deal in this election. And if Donald Trump wins, you might see some very draconian immigration policies, which would be, you know, difficult for Americans living abroad to explain, but popular with Trump's base. But again, even there, the Congress has certain powers, the courts have powers. So the structure matters, the constraints matter. I just conclude by saying I worked in the White House for almost 5 years as a senior advisor to President Bush, worked in the Pentagon under President Clinton, so I know Washington pretty well. The Australian embassy is incredibly plugged in. And no matter who wins, there are a few countries that are so plugged into the US system, they will navigate it pretty effectively. Britain, Australia, Japan. For those who are always suspicious of Canberra and of DFAT, I want you to know that Kevin Rudd and the embassy in Washington are incredibly plugged in. Doesn't mean they'll have fun, but they're very plugged in no matter what happens.
Thanks, Mike. And just on your note about history teachers, my mom recently found a birthday card that she gave me when I was 16 years old, and I told her that she had written it to me, and I said in it that I had a dream of being a history professor. Didn't quite get the history, but I am in political science, so almost got there.
Me too, by the way. 4th grade, I still have it, a letter I wrote to my teacher saying I wanted to grow up to be a history teacher. But like you, I just kept going. I got a PhD, I did political science, but you know what? Political scientists always get frustrated and go back to history. My last 2 books were history, so.
Very true. Yeah, I know. I look a lot of the history of space. I want to talk a little bit about maybe security policy, maybe in context of the US-Sino, US-China relationship. How do we expect this election to impact security policies? I know that there's some concern with China and its operations in South China Sea, et cetera. How do we think that the different administrations may handle that?
Well, there's a very broad consensus, actually. There's a lot of partisan fighting over everything in the US these days. But the one area where there's a pretty robust consensus among Democrats, Republicans across both aisles in the Congress is that we face a real challenge from China, and that the solution is going to have to depend very heavily on working closely with allies like Australia and Japan, new, emerging non-aligned powers like India, shoring up NATO. Our surveys, we do public opinion surveys at the center, Gallup, Pew, Chicago Council, all the surveys show that. The American public broadly is more and more supportive of allies because they can see it's an increasingly uncertain world. I think no matter who wins, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, they are going to try to reduce China's ability to compete with us technologically. And there's broad support for that. Controlling exports of semiconductors, for example, screening investment. Australia does some of this as well. But since Australia is not a tech manufacturing economy like the US or Japan, or Germany, it's not as prominent, but all countries are sort of doing what is now called de-risking, trying to continue trade with China, make money, sell soybeans if you're American, sell iron ore or wine or lobster if you're Australian, but protect core technologies. No matter who wins, that will be a feature. No matter who wins, the next president will talk tougher about China than the Australian Prime Minister. And even if there's a change of government next year in Australia, I predict the American government, no matter who wins, will talk about China in tougher terms than the Australian government does. Part of that is the US is so huge and powerful, the US can get away with a lot, whereas Australia is a little more vulnerable, or Japan or Korea. But in our surveys of the American public, the Australian public, and the Japanese public, for example, views on China are almost perfectly aligned. The public pretty much wants to make money off of China, avoid conflict, but protect values, protect technology. So the rhetoric is going to be tougher in the US and much tougher if it's Trump. But the core view of the problem by the public is pretty close. And as I said, the American public knows, and the government knows, it can't handle China without working closely with our allies. So allies will get a vote in this. The other thing I'd say is I think you will see more and more, and this is going to shape the debate in Australia too, that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea are working together. There are North Korean troops right now in Russia preparing to fight Ukrainians. The South Korean president has said he's going to give munitions to Ukraine to fight back. The Russians are helping Iran target shipping in the Gulf. And the Houthi rebels target shipping in the Gulf to drive up oil prices and to force the US Navy to move away from supporting NATO and supporting Australia and Japan. There's a historian named Hal Brands at Johns Hopkins who's done a net assessment, kind of a ledger sheet, and he figures that China and Russia, Iran and North Korea now are cooperating more than Japan and Germany did in World War II, sharing more munitions, sharing more technology, collaborating more in diplomacy. So that's going to be a feature. It's going to be a complicated, uncertain world where, you know, European countries are going to be coming to Australia because they're seeing one end of this phenomenon. Japanese are going to be talking to Norwegians. It's going to be that kind of dynamic that we have to be ready for.
Thanks, Mike. Sort of speaking in that vein, can we talk a little bit about what we think how the US will interact with BRICS in the next administration?
So the BRICS are a grouping of large countries that have grown rapidly: Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, China, South Africa, hence BRICS, the acronym. They have a regular summit of their leaders, and they proclaim that they will stand up against the developed countries, against Europe and North America and Australia and Japan and Korea, and stand up for the so-called global South. And to some extent that happens. There are two things that are richly ironic in this, though. The first is the acronym BRICS was coined by a Goldman Sachs banker who was trying to get investment. So there's a little irony in the capitalist world giving the nickname to this global South grouping. But the other thing is there is very deep strategic mistrust among that group. India and China fought a bitter hand-to-hand combat in the Himalayan mountains 4 years ago that left dozens on both sides dead. They are each other's main strategic rival, India and China, and they're at the core of BRICS. And there are other complexities as well. When you look at NATO or the EU or Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, there's much more commonality of values. There's much, we frustrate each other. We definitely frustrate each other. I think America especially frustrates everyone, but it's a sibling thing. There's much more common values, much more strategic trust, and formal treaty alliances. As I said, America has 51 security treaties committing to help defend other countries. So the BRICS are there. There is a dimension of speaking up for the developing world, the sort of post-colonial world, the Southern Hemisphere. But there are very, very sharp divisions. There is a possibility of war among members of the BRICS, but it is unimaginable that EU members or OECD members will fight a war. That's my dog voicing his opinion. I think there's a possum in our backyard.
So thanks for that, and thanks, Mike, for your dog voicing his agreement with you. Since we do know that we have some history teachers and other educators on here, one thing that I have always found to be helpful in teaching, and I've taught at the secondary level as well, is those personal stories of having served in an administration, and you have that experience. Could you talk a little bit about how sort of the people behind the big names, so the people behind the president, the administration, the bureaucracy, works in order to support foreign policy agenda?
So, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that the popular culture vision of people who work in the Prime Minister's office or the White House or the State Department is incredibly negative. People love to hate bureaucrats. But in my experience, overwhelmingly, whether it's the Prime Minister and Cabinet or DFAT in Canberra, the White House or State Department in the US, overwhelmingly, these are people who are patriotic, a little bit idealistic, and smart enough to get high-paying jobs doing other things, but really believe in serving the national interest. There are exceptions, of course, but overwhelmingly, these are people who want to, do right by their country, and make a difference, and that's the main thing. The training people get really matters. I found a big difference I was on the National Security Council staff. So this was the staff that works for the president, and my staff that I was in charge of covered the Indo-Pacific. There were other people who covered economics, who covered Europe, who covered immigration or whatever. There was a big difference I found between people who were lawyers, people who were academics, people who were economists, and in many ways, the most successful, most influential people were people who could combine those, who had some kind of interdisciplinary training. That's why the American Studies program at the University of Sydney, where we all teach, is great because it's historians, political scientists, it's humanities. And I found that people who had that kind of interdisciplinary training, who were not trapped in one discipline, but could think as historians when they had to, could think about economics when they had to, they were able, in very high pressure jobs, often asked to go brief the president in 10 minutes. They were the ones who could put together an analysis of a problem and try to come up with solutions. And that goes back to high school. That goes back to high school, what people studied, what they learned, equipped them or not to be effective. And some of these jobs, it was a very intense job, as you can imagine. I was there on 9/11. We had to, I was sent on negotiations to North Korea and China, and it was very intense. And you couldn't do on-the-job training. You had to have an intellectual frame, a policy frame that was well informed. And as I said, not just by political science, but by history, by economics. And the University of Sydney Business School has done a huge study of the future of work and the future of leadership. One of the main conclusions is that future leaders really need that kind of hybrid career. So something for teachers to think about. It's a complicated world, and so you need more disciplines in your head if you can get them.
Thanks, Mike. And I think just to wrap this up, you mentioned a couple times that we've done some polling, but I think it would be interesting for our audience to hear maybe some of your takeaways that are relevant to the election, relevant to what's going to happen in the next 5-10 years in the Indo-Pacific that we got from that polling report. If you don't mind speaking a little bit about that before we transition into actually talking about how we do polling.
Sure. The polling we do at the U.S. Studies Center tries to ask Australians and Americans, and we do Japanese as well, to make some choices. Some polling, Pew polling, for example, I think Lowy Institute polling is a bit more like this. It's more of a temperature check, sort of how do you feel about China or America? Our questions are a bit more, we ask, for example, how much more would you be willing to pay for a mobile phone if it was not made in China? So we're trying to get people to put their money where their mouth is, to test a little bit their preferences. That's hard because the public is not always informed on the issues. So you have to design questions that you can't just say, what's your view on AUKUS? You have to find a way to ask so that you're explaining it to people in the question. What we find is, as I said, US, Australian, Japanese public, very closely aligned on their sense that China is a challenge, their belief that we should not decouple from China. We need an economic relationship. 2/3 in all three countries think we should reduce dependence on China for technology. So it's a somewhat nuanced view and a pretty common across US allies. We asked about Trump and Biden, and as with other polls, we found only 20% of Australians liked Trump. Some people are surprised it's that high, but in India, it's 50%, in Vietnam, it's 50%. In Europe, it's 0.0%, I think, except for Hungary. So Trump is not popular in Australia. But we asked the question last year, if Donald Trump becomes president, would you still support the alliance? And typically in Australia, 2/3 or more of the public supports the alliance with the US, and you get about 12 or 15% who oppose. Last year, when we asked if Donald Trump becomes president, would you change your view? The opposition went up to 30%, which was quite a bit. But this year, when we asked, it only went up by a fraction of that. So I think it might suggest the Australian public may not like Donald Trump. Their negative view of him hasn't changed, but are coming to understand that the alliance is about more than one person, and there's more to the US. There are a few kind of man bites dog surprising answers. We asked the question, how important is it to push for human rights and democracy in Asia? And usually the US government is considered a lot more pushy on human rights and democracy than DFAT, or the Australian government. But when we asked the public, the Australian public was, I think by 8 or 10 points, by a pretty big margin, as I recall, the Australian public was more in favor of pushing countries in Asia on human rights and democracy. And so sometimes it makes you think that the disagreements or variants within Australia or within the US, it's sometimes bigger than the differences between Australia and the US. And then the last thing, which you'll like, Kat, is that when we asked what the alliance should work on, well, two more things. Support for AUKUS, the submarine deal and technology deal with the US, UK, and Australia, has been pretty constant at 50, 51%. Opposition's also about 15%. But we did find a gender gap, which is interesting. Australian women are 20 points behind Australian men in supporting the alliance and AUKUS. So that's an important thing we've briefed to the government that they're scratching their head about. That was interesting. And the other thing I was going to say is when we asked younger Australians and younger Americans what the alliance should work on more in the future, the answer was technology, climate, and space. So that's your field. And we are on the cusp of having the first Australian astronaut going to space. And you and I have both met her, and she's a USyd grad. She's fantastic.
Yes, I'm always happy to hear that young Australians are interested in space. And actually, one of my students is doing some work on AUKUS and Gen Z right now. So really excited to read that. Mike, thank you so much for speaking on that. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, so please drop them in the Q&A box. And also a lot of this, the poll that we're talking about, if you're interested to find out more, you can go to our website, ussc.edu.au, and you can get a lot of this information. And speaking of polling, let me now re-welcome Associate Professor David Smith, who I introduced earlier, who's going to talk to us a little bit about public opinion and polling. So why don't we start just with a broad overview of what is public opinion, how do we use it, and how do we measure it?
Yeah, so public opinion is the public conversation about political issues. It's often not just ideas that people are carrying around in their heads. Usually you have to have a conversation with somebody before you really start thinking about those ideas. Most people are not thinking about politics a lot all the time, or certainly not thinking about all political issues. So it's really important to remember that when we ask people survey questions, we're not just accessing what is in their heads, we're having a conversation with them that brings them into the political discourse. And what they are telling us is public opinion. So surveys are considered the most reliable way of accessing public opinion. A survey, you have to remember, is basically an interview, no matter how much it's, no matter how it's conducted, whether it's conducted in person or on the phone or online. It's an interview. Depending on how many questions you're asking them, it can be quite a lengthy interview. A survey is quite an unnatural thing for somebody to participate in. I think it's always worth keeping this in mind. If you're doing a phone survey, some stranger is calling you up to ask you about politics, which to most people is a taboo subject. So the way that people talk to survey researchers might be quite different from how they talk to, say, their friends or their family about politics. And that's something that as survey researchers, we always have to keep in mind when we have a look at our survey results. There are some issues that definitely matter a lot more to people than other issues. Any issue that affects people directly, they're going to have stronger and more coherent opinions about it. So people have very strong views on inflation, for example, because inflation is something that they have really experienced. People might have less strong and less coherent views on foreign policy. And this is not to say that the survey that we've done is unreliable, but it is important to keep in mind that most people aren't thinking about foreign policy all the time. One of the virtues of the US Studies Centre survey is that we ask people quite broad questions about their general orientation towards the world and to general issues. If we'd started asking them really specific questions about what types of submarine should Australia have, or, you know, where exactly should the border between North Korea and South Korea be, we wouldn't get particularly informative responses out of people because these are not things that they're thinking about in very specific terms. One of the constant findings of political survey research, whenever it's conducted, but there's been a lot of it conducted in the United States, is that people are quite ignorant about a lot of the basic facts of politics. Most Americans wouldn't be able to name all 9 justices on the Supreme Court. About half Americans at any given time can't name who their member of Congress is. And it's easy to look at this and go, well, that's shocking. How are these people even voting if they don't know things about their basic political system? But remember, people don't need to know this information in order to live their lives. They need to know information like, what is the shortest route to my child's school to pick them up? How much can I expect to pay for a litre of milk today? When's the next birthday party that I have to remember? You know, what is my boss going to want to hear in this latest report? This is the sort of thing that people need to know in order to actually live their lives. They don't need to know these kinds of facts about politics, which for people like us, these are our lifeblood, but for most people aren't very important. So I think it's always important to remember about the public opinion environment that it is very messy, it's murky. Most people are not what political scientists would call ideologically constrained. We tend to think that there's a left-wing way of thinking about the world and a right-wing way of thinking about the world, or a liberal way of thinking about the world and a conservative way of thinking about the world. And if you're in favor of abortion rights, you must also be in favor of climate change mitigation, and you must be in favor of high corporate tax rates. Most people are just not constrained in that way. Most people think about things when they think about them at all, they tend to think about issues on an issue by issue basis. They don't think that because they believe one thing, they have to believe another thing. And this is why no matter how many surveys we do, public opinion always has ways of surprising us.
Speaking of that, let's talk a little bit about election polls. How are we conducting them? Maybe let's talk about some of the language. Like, what do we mean when we say registered or likely voter or margin of error? What are the political polls that we're using, and how are they conducted?
Yeah, so you might be seeing a lot of these at the moment. So polls usually have a sample of somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people. 1,000 people is considered a good sample. And you might think, wow, that is not many people to make inferences about a population of 300 million people. But when you are talking to 1,000 people, you can really start to see statistical patterns emerging that will be reflected at the level of the population. If you follow political polls in Australia, you'll be aware that political polls in Australia have a reputation for being fairly accurate at actually forecasting electoral results. One of the reasons for that is because voting is compulsory. That means that any adult that the pollsters are talking to, they can have a reasonable degree of certainty that that person is voting. That is not the case for American pollsters. And that is one of the most difficult things about American public opinion. It's one of the reasons why the polls often miss. It's the fact that pollsters actually have to estimate who is likely to vote. You can ask people whether they're likely to vote, and people might tell you, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to vote. But that's not particularly reliable. And that's because of something in polling called social desirability bias, which is that people tell pollsters the answers that they think that pollsters want to hear, the answers that they think make them look like a good person. And, voting is a good thing to do, good act of citizenship. So a lot of people say, yeah, I'm definitely going to vote. You'll have polls where 90% of people who answer the poll say that they're going to vote. But remember that in the United States, 2/3 turnout is incredibly high. At a midterm election, you almost never even get 50% turnout. So there are a lot of elections that happen in the US. A lot of people don't vote a lot of the time. And it makes it very difficult for pollsters to try to work out who is likely to vote. They make their own guesses based on demographics. So older people are more likely to vote. Based on socioeconomic status, wealthier and more educated people are more likely to vote. But there's only so far that you can actually get with those guesses. And you can see that the same pollsters could look at the same sample of people and actually come to quite different conclusions about how those people are going to vote based on their models about who is likely to vote. About a year out from the election, pollsters don't worry about this so much. They just stick to asking registered voters. So anyone who's eligible to vote, they ask them what their voting intentions are. If the election were held tomorrow, who would you vote for? But as the election gets closer and closer, they start using models of likely voters. So they look at everybody that they've asked. They start weighting it by who is actually more likely to vote in their estimation. And this is where it gets really, really tricky, because as good as their predictive models can be, they're never going to get it entirely right. And with the kinds of incredibly narrow margins that we're seeing at the moment, where in the national poll average, Kamala Harris has less than a 1% lead. If you look at the swing states, nobody has more than a 1% lead anywhere except for Trump in Arizona and Georgia. These are so close that we really don't know who is ahead in these states, no matter how polls are done, because we're looking at a sample of 1,000 people. One of the tools that pollsters use to give an idea of the kind of error that could be made is the confidence interval. So the confidence interval is basically a range that goes around their estimate. So, for example, they would say if 48% of people indicate they'll vote for Kamala Harris in a sample of 1,000 people, then that could be anywhere between 47% and 53%. That's a kind of standard margin of error for a 1,000-person survey, calculated by the combination of size relative to the population size and the standard deviation of their estimates. Now, when we look at all of these poll results that we've been getting recently, where it's 1 point, 2 points at the most, or completely even, we can see that we're in a range where a whole lot of things could happen in this survey. So this is the closest the polls have been for more than 20 years in a US presidential election. And you just have to keep this in mind when you look at the polls, that they're actually giving you a range of potential estimates. They're not giving you a magic number. They're not giving you the gospel of who is in front.
Very good reminders, David. Thank you. Will you talk a little bit about some terminology that you may have heard, our listener participants here on the webinar may have heard, such as what is weighting? What does it mean when we weight a poll?
Yeah, well, this is a very good question, and it's become very important in polling, because polling never gets these days representative samples. These days, response rates to polls are well below 10%. In many cases, they're around 2%. And so the kinds of people who answer polls are people who are relatively enthusiastic about talking about politics. And these are usually more educated people, they're older people, they're people with more time on their hands, they're people with greater proficiency with the English language. And so if you just take the first 1,000 people who answer the phone, that's going to give you an unrepresentative sample. And it's particularly going to give you an unrepresentative sample in educational terms. College-educated people, postgraduate educated people will really be overrepresented in your sample. One way of dealing with this is that when you do the analysis of this data, you weight respondents from underrepresented groups more heavily. So someone, for example, who doesn't have a college education, they are no longer a 1 in your data set. They're a 1.3, for example. Whereas somebody who has a university education might go from being a 1 to a 0.8 or a 0.7. It's widely believed that one of the reasons why the polls missed in 2016 was because of this educational overrepresentation, that a lot of Trump's voters are people without college degrees who were less likely to answer polls in the first place. So in 2020, we saw pollsters weighting a lot more by education. That is, people without college degrees were much more heavily weighted in surveys. And what we found was a polling miss of an even bigger magnitude in the same direction. Even though Biden won that election, it ended up being by about half of the popular vote margin that the polls had predicted. And in the swing states, it was even narrower than that. And what that suggested was that you could only correct so far for these problems by weighting on education. The real problem was that a lot of Trump's voters just tend to be people who are less politically engaged, whether they have a university education or not. And these people are just much less likely to answer the phone to pollsters in the first place. So this is what's known as response bias. That is, who is actually willing to talk to a pollster in the first place. That is something that is very, very difficult to correct for by any form of weighting, because what you need to weight is people who aren't answering the polls in the first place. One solution that pollsters have come up with this year, which is pretty unique, is that they assign weights based on who people say they voted for at the last election. The reason why this is important is pollsters have been finding that their samples have higher numbers of people who say they voted for Biden at the last election than Biden actually got votes. So they'll find that like 55% of their sample say that they voted for Biden at the last election, whereas only 51% of Americans voted for Biden. Or they'll find that only 40% of their sample says that they voted for Trump at the last election, whereas Trump got about 47% of the vote at the last election. And their reasoning is the electorate hasn't changed this much between elections. What this is showing is that we're not picking up Trump voters in our sample. And so what they will do is weight the vote in order to make it look more like the balance that was there in 2020. So if they've only got 40% of Trump voters, they'll weight those votes so that they count for 47% of the vote. Now, this could be the solution to that kind of response bias. It could also be a reason why the polls seem to have moved so little over the last few months, because if that's the way that pollsters are weighting the votes, then they will be consistently getting an electorate in their polls that looks the same. There are a couple of problems with this. One problem is the reason why this technique hasn't been used in the past is because people's memories are notoriously unreliable when it comes to the question, not just of who they voted for in the last election, but whether they voted at all. Once again, remember social desirability bias. People say, oh, of course I voted in the last election, because that's what they think the pollster wanted to hear. You may be surprised to hear that people don't remember who they voted for in the last election. But research has shown this is quite a common problem, and people are more likely to remember having voted for the winner in the last election. So it could be that the reason why pollsters are seeing these samples that seem to have inordinately large numbers of people saying they voted for Biden is just because of a well-recorded phenomena of people always claim that they voted for the person who actually won the last election. So that's one of the reasons why this technique hasn't been used very much before. Another problem with this technique is that it might fail to pick up actual changes that are happening in the electorate. And so one of the chief pollsters of the New York Times, Nate Cohn, he was defending the fact that the polls that they were doing of Florida were getting much more pro-Trump results than other polls were getting. And Nate Cohn was pointing out this is because the New York Times Siena poll is one of the few polls that doesn't use this weighting on recalled vote. And he was saying that the reason why all of these other polls are getting these results in Florida that look quite close, 3 to 5%, is because they're using models that make the electorate look like the last election where the margin in Florida was 3.5%. Their argument is Florida's actually probably got more Republican. It's been getting more Republican. It got more Republican between 2016 and 2020, and there are all kinds of complex reasons for that. And what their poll is picking up is an actual Republican shift. At the same time, their polls of the Midwestern states are a little bit more favorable to Harris than other polling companies have been. And their argument is that Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin have actually potentially got more Democratic over time. One of the reasons is that they have fewer conservative Christians in these states, and the number of conservative Christians in these states is actually shrinking relative to the Sunbelt states. We really don't know who is going to get this right until Election Day. Election Day is when we are going to see who got this right. I can really see arguments both ways for weighted recall voting. I think that weighted recall voting makes it more likely that we're not going to see the kind of massive polling misses, especially in Trump's direction, that we saw last time. But yeah, we will have to wait and see who actually got this right.
Thanks, David. Lots to unpack there, and I hope lots of good information for those of you listening online be able to take back to your classrooms. Let's talk a little bit about another type of polling, exit polls. What are they and how are they used?
Yeah, so exit polls are what take place after the election, where they literally are, well, at least the way that it used to be done, was they're literally waiting outside the polling booths, asking people how they voted. Now, exit polls, for good reasons, are generally considered more reliable than pre-polls because you're actually talking to people who have voted. So you no longer have this problem of trying to estimate who's going to vote and who hasn't. No, you're just talking to people who voted. And presumably, if they've just come out of a polling booth, they've got a fairly reliable memory of how they voted as well. So exit polls are generally seen as more reliable. We actually see in countries that are not the US, often in Britain, Israel, France, they conduct, media organizations conduct massive exit polls immediately after the election. And those are usually considered so reliable that often the election is essentially called by media organizations on the basis of those polls. Now, that can't be done in the US because you're still talking about relatively small samples relative to a huge population. So exit polls generally aren't considered, especially in an election this close, reliable indicators. One of the things that they are very useful for, though, what they're most useful for, is seeing how different demographic groups voted. So most of our information about how different groups, say African Americans, Latinos, men, women, union members, young people, how all of these groups voted, nearly all of our knowledge of that comes from these exit polls that are conducted of people that we know actually voted. The gold standard exit poll is one that is not actually immediately available after the election. It's called the Cooperative Elections Study. It comes out about 6 months afterwards because they do a huge amount of work to validate that people actually voted. And this is a 50,000 person poll. First of all, they ask people before the election how they're planning to vote. Then they revisit these people after the election to see how they actually did vote, if they did vote. And that is the most valuable data source that we have for a guide of how different groups voted at different elections. And if you're ever interested in this stuff, you should look up the Cooperative Election Study, albeit it doesn't happen. It's not available until after the election. Interestingly, though, the results of their pre-poll have just come out, and quite differently from other polls, they have Kamala Harris leading nationally by 4 points. And this is a sample of 48,000 likely voters, although they've got some weird results in that poll as well. For example, they've got Donald Trump getting more than 20% of the African-American vote, that's entirely possible, but it's hard to imagine Kamala Harris leading by 4 points if Donald Trump were to get those votes. The poll also shows Kamala Harris leading with men by 3 points, which is unlike anything that I've seen in any other poll, while also having a lead with women of about 10 points. So it's a very unusual poll. It's just another poll in the end, even if it is one with a very large sample size, like all polls, it shouldn't be taken as gospel. But after the election, that will become the most valuable exit poll that there is. And in 6 months' time, it'll give us a really good idea of how different groups voted. The question of how different groups are going to vote is really one of the keys to this election. There's a lot of speculation that Trump is poised to make significant gains with Latinos, to possibly make significant gains with African-American men. If Trump does make significant gains with African-American men, he's probably quite likely to win, because Democrats really need an overwhelmingly big margin with African-Americans to win. No Democrat has won the majority of the white vote in a presidential election since Lyndon Johnson in 1964. So in order to win, Democrats really need big margins with African Americans and reasonably big margins with Latinos. Trump improved his Latino vote significantly between 2016 and 2020, depending on which exit poll you looked at. His vote was somewhere in the 30s with Latinos. He wants to increase that further. It's worth remembering, though, that might look impressive compared to what Mitt Romney and John McCain got. That's still well below what Ronald Reagan was getting in the 1980s, and it's well below what George W. Bush actually got with Latinos, especially in 2004. Latinos are not a rusted-on Democratic bloc. Democrats have always won the majority, but it's often been very slim. There are some places like Florida. Ron DeSantis won the majority of the Latino vote last time around. Latinos are a very big group. They're a very diverse group. You see different voting patterns within different national groups. You can expect, for example, Cubans in Florida are going to be a lot more Republican-leaning than Mexican Americans in California. Reagan was famous for saying that Latinos are Republicans. They just haven't realized it yet. Certainly, a lot of Latinos have socially conservative values, which would chime with the Republican Party. There's an increasing number of Latinos who are evangelical Protestants who seem to be particularly drawn to the Republican Party, and a lot of Latinos prefer Republican economic policies as well, especially ones which they see as oriented towards business. So they're far from a monolithic bloc. Their vote is really up for grabs, and this could be one of the factors that decides the 2024 election.
Great, thanks for that. As we're getting here close to the end of our time for this webinar, just somewhat of a two-part question I think would be nice to run it out. First of all, we've talked about polls at the national level and the state level. If we could talk a little bit about the difference between those and what we should be watching, but also can we talk about how campaigns use polls and how they conduct their own polling?
Yeah, so first of all, on the difference between state and national polls, getting back to Brendon's point about the Electoral College, there's one school of thought which says you should never even look at a national poll because we've seen twice now in the last 20 years that the national poll doesn't predict the Electoral College, that you should really be concentrating on polls in swing states. And this election, there has been quite a lot of polling of swing states, some more than others. Like there's been a lot more polling of Pennsylvania than Nevada. A lot of these polls use polls of the same sample sizes as they would use for national polls, so they're quite good. But at the moment, the picture is a very murky one because the polls are all so close in these states. But if you're really trying to work out what the Electoral College would do, it's the state level polls that you should be looking at. There are aggregation websites like 538.com that really specialize in just taking all the polls from everywhere and putting them in a central place. Now, in terms of campaign polls, yes, campaigns conduct a lot of their own polls, and they do see it as very important to get the results right. They really need to know where they are, where they need to target. But there's a difference between conducting polls in a very rigorous way that has integrity and what you then tell people about it. Any poll result internally that a campaign releases, there's a political reason for it. And you should be very wary of any poll results that you hear about coming from a campaign. Not because they're necessarily wrong, but because these campaigns are going to be conducting a lot of polls. They're only going to be releasing the ones that contain the information that they want people to hear. Often those will be polls, obviously, showing them ahead in certain places, especially if there's a media narrative that they're behind in those places. But it can work in the opposite direction. If there's a media narrative saying that one party is well ahead in a certain place, they might actually release a poll that says, oh, no, it's a lot closer than that, in order to motivate their own supporters to come out and vote. The key thing is motivating their supporters. So if it appears that they're really behind, they'll release a poll saying, no, it's really close, you've got to come out and vote. If it appears they're too far ahead, they'll release another poll saying, no, it's really close, you've got to come out and vote. So yeah, be very wary of any poll that you actually see being publicly released by a campaign. Now, usually they're not publicly released at all. Usually they will get on the phone to their favorite media outlets and say, oh, just anonymously, here are some poll results from Pennsylvania or Nevada that you might be interested in. But anytime a journalist is saying, I talk to these sources within the campaign and they're worried about this state or they're optimistic about this state, that is strategically placed information by those campaigns. I mean, I saw a headline in the Washington Post today, I think it was, Harris's advisors are quietly confident of winning. You wouldn't expect to hear anything else at this point in the campaign. You wouldn't, so just take anything like that with a grain of salt.
The other thing, Kat, if I can jump in, I've worked on several presidential campaigns, and there are a lot of polls you never see that are testing messages. And when you have 6 or 7 states, and within those states, a handful of counties, because it's not the whole state that's swingy, it's certain counties, and you're targeting tens of thousands of people, they spend a huge amount of money in public opinion polling, testing certain themes with voters they want to get. You can be sure the Republicans are testing what works well with single Latino and Black men, or trade. And what you can see is the result, because Donald Trump's pretty undisciplined. So I don't think he says stuff based on polls. Certainly not much of it. I don't think polls are telling Donald Trump go out and talk about Hannibal Lecter or whether you'd rather be electrocuted or eaten by a shark or whatever. A lot of it's just stream of consciousness entertainment for his supporters. But a lot of the messages, and Harris is particularly disciplined, are tested. So, for example, Donald Trump has promised massive tariffs. Well, tariffs are taxes. They cause inflation, and voters are very unhappy in the US and Australia about inflation. So that Harris's people tested certain messages, and what they decided was they could get Trump on this if they said this is not a tariff, because tariffs would be popular with union workers in parts of Pennsylvania and Michigan. But by saying it's a tax on you, they found some traction. And they tested that in polls and also in what are called focus groups. Well, they get 20 undecided voters and get them to talk about what they think about different words or themes or images. So I saw this when I worked on campaigns, and what you may not appreciate is how much the message the candidate has will change, and not for a national audience, not for a national audience, but for a very specific group of voters you're trying to get in Pennsylvania or Arizona, which back to my original point about structure versus agency, it also means a lot of what people say in campaigns to get those votes in the western part of Pennsylvania, you can't pass in the Congress when the rest of the country gets to say. So you have to discount a lot of the campaigning, more probably than in Australia, where there is more of a national debate about issues. Smaller country, more of a common media market. So yeah, it's a great, big, complicated mess. And I hope we've helped people understand how to teach it better, or at least read the headlines.
Kat, you're muted.
Thanks. Someone has to accidentally speak and mute in a webinar, right? So Mike, David, thank you so much. Mike, thank you so much. Brendon, thank you so much. But Mike, I kind of want to give you the last word, because I've heard you say this a few times over the last month, and I just think it's probably the best answer I've heard. Who do you think is going to win the election?
Yes, my modeling it makes it unequivocal that the next president will be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But the model doesn't tell us which one, but that's at least a start. Honestly, it is, as David said, it is so far within the margin of error. And when you hear David, you can understand how many assumptions and guesses and trial and error goes into coming up with a margin of error that is, in most of these swing states, 2 or 3 times bigger than the gap between the candidates. So it's going to come down to who gets certain people out to vote. Single men for Trump, they're notorious for not voting. Women for Harris, they do vote, but she needs more than usual, that kind of thing. And so the ground game, people talking to their friends, their neighbors, very hard to see from afar, but that is where the action is the next week.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to our panelists here. Thank you so much for giving us some of your night. All of you who have joined today, we've put together a great resource sheet for teaching purposes that can give you some activities for your students. And please, again, as I said, go to our website, reach out to us. We're always happy to help you educate the next generation, because we know how important it is. Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.